Hey everybody, this is Mr. Moffat coming at you with another APUSH video. This is our fourth video in the series focusing in on topic 7.3 on the Spanish-American War and American foreign policy during the age of imperialism. Previously, we have talked about the causes and effects of the Spanish-American War, and we also started to take a look at America's influence in China and the growing influence of the United States under the leadership of Theodore Roosevelt. Now, when we talk about, Theodore Roosevelt, it's not just going to be influence in Latin America with regards to, say, the Panama Canal's construction and the use of what's going to be dubbed the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. It's also going to be seeing America's presence expand in the Pacific, as you can see here on the map. By the time, we get to the Roosevelt presidency, there is a wide number of territories in the Pacific extending as far north as Alaska, as far south as Samoa, and as far west as the Philippines, that is going to be now under the control of the United States. So what does this mean? Well, it means that the United States is now going to be, focusing in on relationships with potential rivals in this part of the world, most importantly, Japan. So let's take a look at this. Now, when we talk about, the United States and its role in the Pacific, part of that role, kind of like we saw in Latin America, is serving as what you might describe as, the constable of the world or the world police to some degree. And this is significant because world powers are not just strong militarily, they are strong diplomatically, that they're going to be able to use their respect and gravitas and, power to be able to solve and, to solve diplomatically and peacefully world conflicts. A case example of this will be the conclusion to the Russo-Japanese War. In 1904, we're going to be seeing Russians and Japanese forces fighting in the Pacific Ocean area, mostly near the Russian city of Vladivostok. And what was kind of interesting about this war was that, Russia was a traditional global power. Japan, kind of similar to the United States, was more of a global upstart in recent years. In fact, the resurgence of Japan as a world power was pretty darn dramatic. I mean, we're talking about the span of about 50, 60 years. Now, what's going to be, once again, interesting about this conflict is that even though Japan's going to be the underdogs in this war, Japan's going to be basically thrown and beaten on the Russians. The Russians are going to get embarrassed. Part of their Pacific fleet's just going to get destroyed, and things look really bad. Now, the Russians are going to be clamoring to end this war pretty quickly. Japan, would benefit from ending it, pretty soon to be able to show this idea that they are now on the world stage and enter in Teddy Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt will be using his position as President of the United States to negotiate what's going to be known as the Treaty of Portsmouth in New Hampshire. And this is going to end this bloody conflict. And in the process, not only does it provide more prestige for the United States on the global stage, but it also lands Teddy Roosevelt the Nobel Peace Prize, the first ever American president to do so. Now, in addition to, being able to work out a deal diplomatic with the Japanese in terms of ending their war with Russia, there's going to be other diplomatic examples of the United States and their relationship with Japan that are going to be of significance. One is going to be the Gentleman's Agreement of 1908. Now, the basis of this is going to be what is going to be just straight up racist policies that the San Francisco, California School Board will be having in terms of segregating Asian students from white students. Now, even though this is purely happening in the United States, the Japanese government is going to be taking great offense to this. Remember, Japan's a growing power. They should be viewed with respect. They're not, for example, segregating German students or British students or French students ethnically or whatever. And so this is going to be, something that the United States is going to have to deal with. Now, understand that at the same time that Japan wants to end segregation in San Francisco schools out of a sign of global respect, the United States also does not want to be seeing a continued influx of Japanese immigration, just like we had already cut off immigration coming from China. And so this gentleman's agreement is going to see what are now clearly the two global powers of the Pacific shaking hands and basically agreeing to both sides. So California's segregationist policy in San Francisco for schools will be abandoned, and we're going to be seeing a limitation on Japanese immigration into the United States. Another example will be the Takahera Agreement of the same year. And basically what this does is it just kind of recognizes that you've got these two growing powers that are kind of throwing their weight around in the Pacific, in Japan and the United States. They're almost kind of like two wrestlers kind of eyeballing each other on the mat. And, instead of gearing towards war, as one would normally kind of think two rivals would be kind of gearing towards, it actually is a statement of respect in terms of recognizing the territorial acquisitions of both the U.S. and the Japanese in the Pacific. So it's kind of one of those things where it's a peace treaty and recognizing, hey, you're a powerful, important country in the Pacific, and so are you. So that's going to be, pretty significant. Now, that being said, do not think that Roosevelt is purely a softie, and using just pure diplomacy to try to secure America's global interests. Remember, this is a guy that, likes a good war. He is very pro-military, and especially within the military, he is certainly pro-Navy. And that's going to then bring us to the example of the Great White Fleet. The Great White Fleet is going to be a showcase of America's growing modern Navy, which by this point in time is one of the best in the world. This new fleet, painted white as the name describes, is going to be going on tour around the Pacific Rim. Now, on the surface, it's just a showcase of, America's modernity in the military, specifically the Navy. And also on the surface, it's designed as a way to, just kind of, improve relations with nations across the country. Here's the United States, yada, yada, yada. But really the deeper meaning behind this is to send a message to Japan, our only true rival in the Pacific. Basically telling the Japanese, look at what we have, look at what we can do, watch us flexing our muscles, metaphorically speaking. Don't mess with us, because we have the power to hurt you badly. And that's what's something that Roosevelt really liked to do. And once again, this fits in very neatly and nicely with this mantra of speak softly and carry a big stick. This is, in many respects, the epitome of that. We're not blowing things up. We're not declaring war, but we are, showing our big stick, so to speak, letting the Pacific Rim, particularly Japan, know that we are a major power to be reckoned with. Okay? All right. Now, let's kind of get away from Roosevelt for just a moment and take a look at some other examples of emerging foreign policy in this age of imperialism. And it then brings us next to President William Howard Taft. Now, we'll talk a lot about Taft as a progressive domestically, but on the global stage, we're going to describe William Howard Taft's foreign policy with the phrase dollar diplomacy. Now, dollar diplomacy is, shifting America's focus in foreign policy matters, particularly in Latin America, towards protecting American business interests. And so it's the idea of not just flexing our muscle militarily to show off how great we are, kind of like a Roosevelt mindset, but we're really using the military to protect what seems to be a more primary concern, American profits. And so we will see, for example, during the Taft administration, we'll see American troops sent down to Nicaragua, American Marines going down there. Why? To secure a Nicaraguan government that is friendly to American businesses. That's really the gist of dollar diplomacy. If your Latin American government is starting to look unfriendly to American business and you're, starting to kind of throw out, the word of nationalizing, meaning government takeover of foreign businesses, the Taft administration is not having that. And in many respects, dollar diplomacy is going to define a lot of American foreign policy throughout the 20th century. It may not have that name, dollar diplomacy, but that idea of protecting American business interests militarily, that's certainly going to be something that we will see moving forward for sure. Now, in addition to that, we have to be mindful of the impact of Woodrow Wilson and foreign policy. Now, first off, you got to understand that similar to Taft, Woodrow Wilson's not going to be afraid to, send over American military personnel to foreign countries to look out for American interests. In fact, if you take a look at the map here, you're going to see that the United States is going to be sending troops to Haiti, here on the western part of the Hispaniola, and to the Dominican Republic. In Haiti, we'll send troops there because the Haitian president will be assassinated, and there was a sense that rebels in that country are going to take over the government and take over American businesses. So we send troops down there to secure a pro-American government. But note, we're going to actually outright occupy Haiti for about 20 years. It's about a whole generation that we're just going to militarily occupy Haiti until we decide to turn it over. Next door in the Dominican Republic, kind of a similar thing. There's not an assassination of a foreign leader, but there is a concern of American interests in the government there. In other words, it was becoming an unfriendly government to the United States. Well, the United States is not having that. We send in troops to basically topple that regime, and we do occupy the Dominican Republic for 8 years until we get a government established that we like that is U.S. friendly. So what is this telling us? One of the things about imperialism is that the United States is seemingly not afraid to use its military muscle, to use its resources, to basically topple governments in Latin America that we just don't like. It really is amazing that we don't really respect a lot of the sovereignty of these Latin American countries. In other words, if you're not pro-America, then you run the risk of getting your government overthrown potentially. So that's certainly a flex that is certainly new now in the age of imperialism. Now, that being said, we can also describe America's foreign policy from the perspective of what we would describe as moral diplomacy. The idea being that the United States has a responsibility of limiting our imperialist actions, which is kind of an interesting dichotomy with what I just talked about with Haiti and the Dominican Republic. But bottom line, Wilson was not as strong of an imperialist as his three predecessors, Taft, Roosevelt, and McKinley. And we see some evidence of this in terms of policies that are going to be created with some of our possessions. You may remember previously that we talked about how, following the insular cases, that countries that were now under the control of the United States were not guaranteed rights under the Constitution, per se. You're just conquered peoples. Well, we're going to start to see that change with the passage of the Jones Act in Puerto Rico. The Jones Act, as you can see here, is going to protect, rights for Puerto Ricans under the U.S. flag. They're going to be given full territorial status. There's not going to be any more tariffs on Puerto Rican goods. There's going to be some degree of Puerto Rican self-governing. And yes, even though Puerto Rico will still not be able to vote for president, still to this day, still does not have voting representation in Congress, such as it is today, Puerto Ricans are going to be on the road to becoming U.S. citizens as they are today. We're also going to be seeing a similar thing happening in the Philippines. So understand that, via the Jones Act with Puerto Rico and with the Jones Act in the Philippines, you're going to be seeing, a little bit more of a softening of the harshness of American imperialism. We're going to go ahead and leave it there for now. We'll come back with one more video focusing in on American foreign policy during the Mexican decade of revolutions in the 19 teens. We'll see you next time.